All right. We'll start on time so we can end late. No, we'll start on time so we can. I used to teach a home Bible study. I had this old guy come in every time. He said, "We're 5 minutes late. We have to finish early." That's what he used to say. So, all right. I want to lead in a word of prayer, and then we'll start. Our gracious God, as we come tonight, we ask for your presence to be here, not just because you indwell us, but because your Spirit is interested in what this church does to honor you, to serve your mission, to be the kind of congregation that brings honor and glory to you. So I pray that you will give us help, you will give us a facility of thinking and speech and dialogue, and may this be a good evening, not only from our perspective, but more importantly from yours, for the sake of your church and your kingdom. And I pray this in Jesus' name, amen. Before I start, I want to know if any of you have any questions from last night. Sometimes when like we did last night, my best question comes the next morning when I'm taking a shower and think, why didn't I ask that, or why didn't I think of that? So does anyone have anything you want to ask about anything we said last night?
I do have one question.
Yeah.
You made a comment, and I couldn't decide if I got it reversed or not. You talked about Dee, you talked about Rob, you talked about Bill Kane, and you talked about Tom. You said, I think they didn't come through the type of education you came through, so they...
No, they all came through the same kind of education I did.
Okay.
And none of us, from my perspective, were taught what the Bible really says about the church. Yeah, that's the point I was trying to make. Okay. So what I was trying to point out is, you take someone like Dee, who was very, very capable pastor and leader, but often was doing what he had seen, was doing what he was taught, and the seeds for what we're seeing now in our nation, where the church is in decline, where Christianity, it's one of the as I said, there's 3 continents where the church is dying: Europe, North America, and Australia. And really, much of what we learned about the church came to this nation from Europe, and Australia and New Zealand's also from Europe. That theology that was permeating all of the seminaries, they had some pretty good ideas about God and Bible until liberalism hit. But in terms of what the church should be, in part because when I went to seminary, when they went to seminary, we were living in a Christendom culture. So in a Christendom culture, one of the things I didn't talk about yesterday is everybody in the culture had guilt about God, had guilt about heaven. I mean, I remember watching, old Bing Crosby movies when he was, Going My Way and Priests and Boys Town and all those old black and white movies. The idea was that going to church was something everybody was supposed to do. So the kind of church that the Bible talks about, because the first church existed in a totally pagan culture where it had no influence, it had no political leverage, and that's when the church grew. We weren't taught to think about the church that way. As one person at Asbury Seminary says, for many years, every church basically had a home field advantage. And now every game we play is an away game, and we don't know how to do it. So that's what I'm talking about. But I had to learn that from other pastors who had figured it out. It was not something I got from seminary. Okay. No, I'm glad. That's good clarification. Anybody else? Okay. In just a moment, I'm going to give you the report, and we're going to work through the report tonight. And because I was able to get it done, it's actually in print. If you find any errors, by the time I've gone through something the 3rd or 4th time, I'm my own worst editor. So please forgive any errors, but I've found a bunch of them because I know I always will. I want to respond to a question that was asked several times, some when I met with the elders, but also asked by other people. Why has, for example, the whole issue around music and worship leaders and pastors and sessions, why has that happened over and over and over again? My description has been, it's about every 4 or 5 years, it seems like there's a train wreck And the train wreck always happens at the same junction. You know, it's always happening in the same place. And others have said, why can't we just kind of put everything just forget everything and let's move ahead? As someone who works with churches all the time, the reason you can't do that is because when those things happened, and whether it was the fault of the session, whether it was the fault of the pastor, whether it was the fault of the worship leader, whether it was everybody's fault, when it's not handled well in God's economy, that sin keeps going. And I go into church after church where there's just systemic sins that keep on going. In fact, as I've talked to a number of people who work with churches like I do, we're convinced there's three things that cause God to write Ichabod across the church, and nothing can happen. One is when there is immorality that keeps happening and gets buried. It may be sexual immorality, it may be financial immorality, but where there's things that are just unethical and there's no integrity and everybody keeps covering it up. We have learned that no matter what that church does, you're best to close it and start over. Okay. The second one is where people are forced to leave. They're urged to get out, they're asked to get out, they're kind of forced out, they're marginalized. And sometimes that's people in the congregation, sometimes it's pastors. I mean, I've been in churches where they have a pastor every 2 or 3 years. And the pastor's, it's just known. You're not really a smart pastor if you go to that church because you're not going to last long. And nothing is ever done about it. And then the third issue is where there has been the occult has been involved in the church. And again, I don't know where you are, but when I get to churches where there have been highly influenced by the Masons, there's a whole series of churches up and down the Front Range of Colorado that back in the 30s and 40s were Ku Klux Klan churches. And it doesn't matter what you do. It's as though God says, I'm not going to put up with that in my church. Okay. And so what I'm saying is, if the issues that come up aren't dealt with biblically, then they're going to keep happening. It doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't matter what you say or forget. It's going to happen. And here there have been some systemic issues. Now, I don't think your church is in the three that I have described. So don't, just pack your bags and get out of here. That's not what I'm talking about. But I am saying if you don't deal with those issues, it doesn't matter what happens. And so part of my report, in fact, the first part of my report is, how do you change those issues? How do you change them so that God honors what good things are happening here and they don't keep reoccurring? So I just wanted to say that by way of introduction, okay? So with that in mind, I'm going to...
Paul, do you want to amend something you said?
Yes.
I don't think there's been influence by, but since you pointed out the Masons, there are a lot of people in that cemetery and who are currently here who are Masons. Yeah. And I don't know who, because it's a secret society, I don't know who entirely. I just know that we did have an issue. And I also know that the women's part of, so that's the Freemasons, the men, there's the...
Eastern Star, I think it is.
Is it Eastern Star? We have Eastern Stars here too. Now, what I'm not sensing is that there is influence in the sense that I don't sense the influence coming from that, like you're gonna, this is all happening. No. But there are a number of our folks who have, and less now who are, part of those societies. Well,
I've been in a number of churches where if you want to be on session or the board or whatever, you've got to be connected somehow that way. And I haven't picked up a cent of that here, but I'm just using that as an illustration of what we have seen in churches. So churches, in a sense, churches have pathologies just like we as people have pathologies. The problem with established congregations, particularly one like yours that's 200 years old, is your church reflects the pathology of about 20 pastors. Okay? Church plants, the church planter inflicts his or her pathology on the church. And so that's why often they don't have as many problems, because people come because they either like that person or they want to be around that person. But the problem in these churches is to say, how do we separate the pathology that's there from what God wants in the church? And that's what these kinds of weekends like this, from my perspective, give the church an opportunity to do. Okay? And I see weekends, or now it's more than a weekend here, but the process as giving your church a chance to start over. Okay? One reason why pastors want to go plant churches is they don't want to mess with established congregations with all the junk that's there. And I can understand that, but I have seen God redeem churches. Like I said, Middle Press, which was started in 1772, had the first ordained pastor west of the Alleghenies, and God has changed that church and has turned it around. And I've seen that happen in churches of 20, and I've seen that happen in churches of 2,000. So that's what this, from my perspective, this is what this is about. And that's why I've written the report the way I've written it. Okay? So if somebody will help me distribute these reports. Whoops, I'm sorry. Oh. Yeah, that's your penalty for taking the seats up front. Here, take this one and let me. Oh.
It's got the second page over there.
Oh, okay. Oh, then.
I'll just.
Yeah. If you don't get the front page, it says Bethel Presbyterian Church Resolution Report to Session.
I've got the front page.
Yeah.
Whatever. Oh, and I ended up with it.
Oh, there you go. Okay. All right. I'm actually going to read through the report, but I'm going to stop and do a lot of explanation when we get to different parts. This report to the session comes after reading and rereading materials sent to me, including responses to a series of questions that I sent to the leaders, which you as the session saw, and many of you provided some answers in interaction with. An interaction with close to 90 people holding a wide variety of opinions. I have summarized my perceptions into 4 major areas of concern that are listed in the report. You'll notice this is a short report. I do not write long ones because nobody does anything with long reports, okay? That doesn't mean you necessarily deal with a short report, but they don't do anything with long reports. I have the decision to embrace or ignore these prescriptions, in my opinion, needs to be made soon, since delay will cause the impact they can have to dissipate over time. I am suggesting that a decision to act should occur by the 1st of December, since to not make a decision by then will have the same effect as deciding to ignore them. I realize that the ultimate decision is up to the session. Okay. Now, one thing that is not in the report, but I have gotten questions by people since I've talked to so many, what's going to happen to the report and what will we know about the report? And I've understood where at times, at least what I've heard and what I've seen, is some reports have sometimes even been hidden from some people in the session in the past. So one of the things you're going to have to think about is first of all, are we going to embrace this report or are we going to reject that report? But then the other question is, a lot of people know what's happened, so to not say anything will create higher levels of distrust between the congregation and the session. Okay? So, concern number 1, disobedience to the Word of God. By the way, in my opinion, of the 4 problems, this is the biggest one. Okay? That's why it's number 1. The leaders in congregation for a number of years have failed to make the command of the Great Commission of Jesus to make disciples the value that drives the behaviors of the congregation. I believe the mission here for many years has been, how do we please the people who are here, not how do we do the Great Commission. For many years, pastors, people on staff, and other leaders of the congregation have been treated in ways that are not compatible with the teaching of Scripture. The way pastors have been treated, the way staff have been treated, the way people have been fired. I've just heard stories even from people on different sides, the belief that people have not always been treated well. Promises to keep confidentiality have often been broken. Of things that happen in session somehow get communicated when they're not supposed to be. That's just one example. Gossip, rumors, grumbling, slander, and other sins of the tongue have gone unpunished. Many in the congregation have seldom practiced repentance for their sins and sought forgiveness for their offenses toward others. And that's why the problems keep going on and on and on. Now, let me talk about an issue that always comes up on this time. Well, what about the issue of judging? Jesus said, don't judge unless you want to be judged. If you go on and see the words of Jesus and see the words of the New Testament, I can judge a person's words. Because if I cannot judge a person's words, you cannot determine who false teachers are. So you as a congregation made a judgment about PCUSA that much of their words were against the scripture, which is in large measure why you joined ECO, and that's a legitimate judgment, okay? I cannot judge, I can judge behaviors. If I cannot judge behaviors, you cannot practice church discipline. So when the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 5 says, this person is sleeping with their mother, that's a behavior. He says even the pagans don't do that. And he makes a judgment. What I cannot judge are motives. Now it's interesting to me, not all, but much of what I heard in all the interviews were about motives. Now, this is why the pastor's doing this. This is why Session's doing this. This is why this group's doing that. This group wants this, and this is, in fact, some of, I could make money if I wanted to be a conspiracy theorist with all the things I've heard. And much of the conversation that was there was about motives. The only way I can judge your motives if you tell me what your motives are. And the older I get, the more I agree with the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 4. Sometimes he says, I don't even know my own motives. I sometimes have mixed motives, okay? But the number one sin the New Testament talks about is the sin of the tongue. And that sin has been allowed for years to go without being punished. Now, let me say something else. If this church has been having a series of problems, and let's just take the one issue that everybody talks about, music and worship has been going on for 20, 25 years. As I've said to people, when I go in public and I see children acting up, they're misbehaving, I blame the parents. I don't blame the kids. I blame the parents. So if all this stuff has been happening, the parents in Presbyterian congregations, the session. So not only have people been misbehaving, but the sessions have not been doing what sessions do. Now, remember, I said that health is a choice, and the older you get, the more difficult the choice. If you decide you want to get serious about what God wants to do in this church, you've got to realize you will be the first session that says to the congregation that's been spoiled children for years, that's no longer going to happen. That's a tough choice. Okay. When I was in seminary, I went to Dallas Seminary. We used to babysit for people in Highland Park. I don't know if you know where Highland Park is, but that's where the crumb, the old money is. And we babysat two boys. Parents went away for a week, and nobody ever told us anything, but we could tell by the first night they were not used to having anybody tell them no. And my wife and I both told them no, and that night, one of the boys tied sheets together, climbed out over the roof, and went across the neighbors and said we were mistreating them. only to find out from the neighbors, gee, you must have been telling them no, because we know the parents never tell them no. Okay. So you realize what I'm saying here is, as I describe the problem, this is a major problem, and it's going to require some tough decisions. Okay. Now, for me to say to you it's a problem and not talk to you about how to deal with it, you'll notice under it says prescription 1, a solemn assembly. The leaders need to formally, by leaders I'm talking now about the session and staff. When I talk to a church, I what I call the leadership community, session and staff. Have a service or a series of services, and because in pre-COVID in COVID you may need to do in a series of services, where they seek forgiveness for the sins of individuals and the congregation collectively, where you as elders, staff as staff, stand in front of the congregation and all of you pray individually out loud and say, we've sinned. We have sinned in our own responsibilities. Sessions before us have sinned, and we're coming to ask God forgiveness. Now, it's amazing when I say this to Presbyterian churches, the number of times I hear back, what do we need to repent for? And I feel like saying, you keep going to adult Sunday school. Haven't you learned anything? I don't know about you, but I have to repent every day. Coming to God and say, God, I blew it with you. Okay. I'm going to talk about this, but I want to read through it. So the service need to be led by pastors, staff members, and session members. Prayers need to be offered, asking God for the forgiveness of the failures of both current and past leaders, including former sessions that did nothing to deal with the sins of the congregation or their own sins of treating people in ways that were unbiblical. All former pastors and staff members need to be contacted formally to ask for their forgiveness for the ways in which those former leaders feel they were treated poorly or badly by the congregation and its leaders. So as one person who had been here under both Dee Dee and Rob said, Rob often caught flack because he striped the parking lot, and Dee Dee said he would never have stripes in the parking lot. Stupid stuff like that, okay? People in the traditional service need to ask for forgiveness of the ways they have talked about those who attend Worship Cafe, and people in Worship Cafe need to ask forgiveness for how they have talked about those in the traditional service. The same is true for choir members and worship team members, etc. Ask forgiveness for how they've talked about each other. Those longtime members need to ask forgiveness for how they have talked about those they disagree with, including the pastor in session. And pastor in session need to do the same for any individuals or groups in the congregation they have had problems with over the years. Those who have come in the last 20 years, the pioneers who have now come among the settlers, okay, need to ask for forgiveness for the longtime members who have they've spoken about, and any perceived slights they have received. And I heard a number of those. The last paragraph, and then I'm going to tell you a story, and then I'm going to open this up for questions. Once this time of confession is over, no one in the congregation will be allowed in any public or small group setting, including Sunday schools, to speak of any past issues since, if these prayers are genuine, forgiveness has been granted. This process should be completed by January 31st, 2021. Any people who have left the church over any issue that want to return will be expected to have a time of repentance and forgiveness with 2 or 3 elders before they will be allowed to come back and be part of the body again. People in the congregation now who will not participate in these collective behaviors will not be allowed by session to have any ministry position in the congregation. Seven, 8 years ago, I was invited to work with a district of Wesleyan churches from Albany, New York, north all the way up to Maine. The main church that had been part of that district was in Queensbury, New York, which is a suburb. It's a bedroom community of Albany. It was called Ridge Road Wesleyan Church. At one time, the church had been the flagship church of the district. It had been about 400, which in that part of the country is a really large church in terms of other churches. When we got there, it was a church of 90. This was a church that most pastors never lasted more than 2 or 3 years. It was like a revolving door of pastors. The pastor who was there when I was invited with the district superintendent to go do the weekend had only been there about 9 months, so he was still half liked. Okay, he already had people who didn't like him, but there were still some who liked him. So I always interview the pastor first. And we said, I asked some questions like I asked you, what do you like about your church? And I said, what needs for your church to change? He said, well, Paul, he said, we're living in a suburban area. This is not a small town. He said, but if my wife and I go to a restaurant or I go to get my hair cut and the barber or the waiter or waitress who's waiting on us asks, are you new to the area? Yeah, what do you do? Well, I'm a pastor. What church? Oh, Ridge Road Wesleyan Church. Said the common response is, that's a shame. Because the community knew what happened to pastors. Okay. Most churches have a neutral reputation in the community. Some churches have a positive, but when a church has a negative, you've got to earn that. So we're doing interviews, just like I did here. And everybody came in, told how they would go to Sunday school, but they wouldn't go to worship service because they didn't like the people in the worship service. Others said, we go to the worship service, we don't go to Sunday school because we don't like the people in Sunday school. Some people would say, we sit on the right-hand side of the congregation because we don't like the people on the left-hand side of the congregation. We don't like this group, we don't like this group, etc. And halfway through the deal, the district superintendent said to me, Paul, if this were one of your churches, because I was still working with the churches of California, he said, if this is one of your churches, what would you do? I said, his name was Paul also. I said, Paul, these are Baptist churches. I can't do anything. They got a mind of their own. Independent Baptist is a redundant term. He said, well, what would you do? Now, 90 people on a Sunday. I said, if I would, I'd close the church. Because every day this church is opening, it's ruining the testimony of Jesus. And that's not why Jesus created the church. So we finished all the interviews. About another day went by, we finished all the interviews. And he said to me, he said, Paul, now he's the district superintendent, he said, I think we need to close the church. I said, really? He said, yeah. I said, well, how are you going to do that? He said, well, in the Wesleyan denomination, we have a thing called developing status. And the board of the district can put a church in developing status, which means go stand in the corner. Every church, nobody wanted to be put in developing status. He said, we're going to put it in we want it to be in developing status, and when they're in developing status, the board of the district is the board of the church. So if they're in developing status, then we'll close the church. But, he said, we want the church on their own to vote to do that. I said, Paul, you're crazy. I said, you can kill a human being in the United States and get away with it easier than you can a church. All you need is an LA jury. Doesn't matter if you're OJ or Robert Blake, you can get off. He said, well, that's what we're going to say. I said, okay. So when I gave the report, Sunday morning I preached like I did here. Then people stayed. I gave the report and I said, we only have one prescription. And that is that you will vote to put yourself in developing status, knowing that the board of the district will close the church. Well, as you can imagine, when we left the service, I was just glad to get out of there and in my car and away before, anything happened negatively to me. But we said to the pastor, that was to happen, I think it was about 5 weeks. We gave them the deadline, 5 weeks, where they would vote. And I was sure they would vote not to do that. We said, you need to have a Sunday of repentance to see what God will do. He said, okay. So he and his board, they had about 4 or 5 board members, and they were kind of on board. They wanted to see God do something. They planned that Sunday. So that Sunday morning, when people walked in, the 90 people walked in. Now, there were other people who had been to Sunday school. They'd already walked out. But the 90 people walked in. They sang a hymn, made a few announcements, took up the offering. And then a lady stood up. And she said to the congregation, folks, for years, we have gossiped, we have slandered, we have talked about each other, we have people. Some of you sitting on that side of the aisle will not talk to people on this side of the aisle. Some of you won't come to Sunday school because you don't like people. In a moment, I'm going to pray and ask God to forgive us collectively as a congregation, and the congregations that have come before us to forgive us. And then she said, when I get done praying, I'm going to give you time to get up out of your seats and go across the aisle and find that person you don't like and make things right. The district superintendent had gone that day. He called me that Sunday afternoon and said, Paul, she said, amen. She said, all right, now get up. He said, I have never seen this before. For 30 minutes, people were getting up, walking across the aisle, some going to the altar, some finding a quiet area in the back, weeping, crying, saying, forgive me. He said the Spirit of God showed up in a powerful way. By the time that was done, the person in the Wesleyan church, the pastor runs the board meetings just like the pastor in Presbyterian churches runs the session meeting, but they also have another lay person. Has a little bit more authority than the clerk of session, but that person got up. He said, for the last 40, 50 years, all the boards of this church, we're the ones responsible before God for the life of the church. And we've let all this happen, and we've done nothing about it. So I'm going to pray and say, God, forgive our board and the boards that preceded us for failing in their responsibility before God to be the stewards of that congregation. And he prayed. The pastor got up, and then he said, folks, you need to know in the last 3 weeks, we have written a letter to every pastor who was here and left. And said to them, we know no pastor is perfect, but when you were here, we're pretty convinced that you faced a number of hurts. People talking about you, people slandering you, people questioning your motives. We're having a service of repentance. We want to invite you to come so we can ask for your forgiveness. If you can't come, we're asking you in this letter, would you please forgive us for how we treated you? That Sunday, the most recent pastor, who'd only been there 2 years, showed up. The district superintendent said he was sitting in about the 4th pew. It was him, his wife, and their 3 kids. The son was a junior in high school. The next year would be voted all county lineman, so big kid. Daughter in middle school, and a boy in about 4th grade. So the pastor looked at him. His name was Mark. And I've met Mark. I've asked Mark about this. He said, Mark, when you were here, we as a church did a number of things that weren't right with you. And so I'm asking you, will you forgive us? And then he looked at his wife. He said, in some ways, it was worse for you. Not only did people talk about you, but you watched as they picked on your husband. Would you forgive us? And they looked at these 3 children. He said, kids, you need to know. What you saw us do to your parents was not right. Your parents are good parents. And this football player just began to sob and rock back and forth on the pew. So Mark stood up. He said, I do forgive you. He said, by the way, I did this, and I did this, and I did this. Would you forgive me? His wife stood up and she said, I was so angry when we left here. I trashed the parsonage. Will you forgive me? Then the district superintendent stood up. He said, over the years, we have done some things wrong to your church. Will you forgive us? And then the entire congregation literally got down on their knees and said, God, forgive us for not doing the Great Commission, being so focused on our anger that we have not obeyed you. Will you forgive us? And then the service was over. 2 weeks later, of the 90 people who attended, 65 who were members showed up and voted unanimously to put themselves in developing status. And 2 months later, the church closed. Now, as Paul Harvey would say, the rest of the story, the pastor who had church planning background gathered about 20 people from the church. For about a year, they met in a restaurant on a Sunday morning, and he began to train them to develop a church plant. They came back and opened the church, painted it, put another name as Doing Business As. And within the first year, they saw over 200 people coming to church and a bunch of people coming to Jesus. Folks, in my opinion, this is the most important of all the prescriptions. And I'm convinced if you don't do this, then all the money you spent with Oxano, money you paid me, money you paid Tag, it's been a waste. Because I don't think God's going to bless if you continue to act like you've been acting as a church. Questions?
Well, when you said, if I heard you right, we're not to judge motives.
Mm-hmm.
What if someone's motive is to sow discourse because they're unhappy?
Well, then you can look at their behaviors. Say you talk to that person, and what you talk to them, we know, we've heard that's a lie. You've talked to this person. You look at the behaviors. Now, I don't know why you're sowing discourse, and that's not the point. The point is the behavior is what we're judging. Okay, that's what I'm saying.
And can you, on the first page, the last sentence, those who have come in the last 20 years need to ask for forgiveness for the longtime members who they have spoken about and any perceived slights they may have received.
Yeah, I had people say, I've been here in the last 20 years, and certain people have been here long before them, because there's some people who have been 30, 40 years, said they still don't talk to me. They still look right past me. One person said, I've had a significant role in that particular ministry, and some of these people, or at least one person, still won't call me by my name. That's what I'm talking about.
Thank you.
Okay? Anything else? Okay.
So sorry, the logical part of me comes out and just wants some clarification, because if you have to start explaining what this all means,
Sure.
you need to make sure you actually understand it. People in the congregation now who will not participate in these collective behaviors. So how do you know? Like, Is it a sign-up sheet? Do you check off people's names, or or is it just well, we know you were outspoken that you didn't do it? I mean, is this a hard and fast, you were either here or you weren't, or how does that work?
Well, I've seen enough churches do this, and it's amazing how God blesses after they do it, where people get highly creative. Well, I can't be there that Sunday. Okay, fine. Then we're going to set up a time with this team of elders where you can come in, and maybe we'll have 3 or 4 different families come in, and we'll deal with it at that point. Or people say, no, I haven't done this. Okay. Have you lived perfectly in this congregation that whole time? We all have. And by the way, let me say in regard to this, one of the reasons why I keep saying we, when you look at the Old Testament prophets that said to Israel, you've done this, you've done this, you've done this. 2 in particular that I always focus on, one I just saw recently. In Daniel chapter 9, Nebuchadnezzar came 3 times to Jerusalem, 605, 596, and then 586 was when he destroyed the city. Daniel's taken in 605. And he's reading Jeremiah, and he realized that Jeremiah said there's going to be 70 years of captivity. And I believe he prays in Daniel, God, will you start counting at 605, not 586, because that means the captivity's almost over. And then he begins to confess the sins. And all the way through there, the pronoun is we. Now, here's a person who didn't do all that idolatry. He wasn't involved in that, but he identifies with the community of God and says, we have sinned. And when people say, I'm an individual Christian, I don't have to be a part of this, say, no, this is about the body. That's part of the theology behind it. Nehemiah, who hears that the walls are broken down, and when he begins to pray to God about it and talks about how God had punished, he starts out, I and my family, we have sinned. We're part of the group. We live in a nation where the individuality of the Christian is constantly tearing away at the community of the body of Christ. And so what we're saying is, I'm not trying to say this has to be a legalistic where you're having people say they weren't here, but to say, look, folks, we're serious about this. And if you don't want to participate, we're not going to make anybody participate. But you need to realize, if you're going to stand apart from the body, many of you I've met you, you have good hearts. A lot of this, at least with the other sessions, you weren't even here to do it. But there's a sense that we're in this as the community of God, and we're praying that God's blessing will be poured out on us collectively. In 1 Corinthians 3, where it talks about Jesus or the Spirit indwelling the church, the concept there is not indwelling you or me. That's in 1 Corinthians 6. When he indwells the church, he's indwelling all of us collectively. I mean, in one sense, we as Christians never have to pray, will the Holy Spirit be here? Now, often we mean, will you show up in a special way is what we mean. But we don't have to pray for the Spirit to be here. But when I act as an individual and say, I don't want to be part of this whole repentance process for whatever reason, whatever your motives are, this behavior is to demonstrate that we're in this collectively. And we'll make provision. We understand that you're in Charlotte. I mean, people work. Not everybody can be here whenever you do it. Or whether you do a series of these, and maybe in a COVID time. I think if you do it in COVID time, I suggested, Tom, where the staff and elders are filmed, each one praying, God forgive us. And what do we like to then collectively get down on your knees and just begin to pour out your hearts to God and say, God, will you forgive us? And then you take that and say to the deacons, we want you to be a part of this. We take it to this group. We want to take it to this Sunday school class. We want you to be a part of this. That's what I'm thinking of. Does that help?
It does. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
How do you define ministry position?
Well, if you want to be a Sunday school teacher, if you want to lead a small group, if you want to be in charge of men's ministry, a women's ministry, wherever you're contributing something with your gifts and talents to the body. Okay?
Dr. Borden, how do you suggest this whole concept is introduced to the congregation?
Oh, I think it needs to be introduced probably through a series of sermons 2 or 3 weeks. I think to look at how the Old Testament prophets prayed, how even in the New Testament, look at the sin of Achan with Joshua, but then in the New Testament, how God deals with Ananias and Sapphira because he doesn't want that. And, Paul says at times to the Corinthians, I couldn't come to you because you still weren't getting your act together, and I didn't want to come and crack the whip, as it were. But now that you have done it, when you get to 2 Corinthians, he says, I can't wait to get there because not only have you disciplined that brother, now you need to receive that brother back because the discipline has worked. So I think it needs to be a series of, and this whole idea that we are part of the community of God. And we as a community of God for the last number of years, we have had this issue after this issue. I talk to these people. The settlers who were here from the beginning, they're upset. We're losing our church. And I feel like saying, it's not your church, but we're losing our church. Now, I understand what they're saying. Things aren't the same, but you're not going back to 1950. You're not going back to, you can't. But then other people say, well, if that's where they are, tell them to go jump in the lake. No, that's not right either. That if unity, by the way, and I'll talk about this right now, unity is not related to everybody being in one big room singing Kumbaya. Unity is when a whole variety of people with all kinds of talents, interests, passions, backgrounds, economic statuses get together around a common mission. You as a session have said, we now have our mission and vision. So right now, you as a said, we believe for us now, this is God's will. So any of you go to a Panther game? I don't know how many that stadium seats, but let's say it's 70,000. Most of those people don't know each other. And having seen Panther fans, I'm glad I don't know most of them. Okay, all right. But for 3.5 hours, they are unified. They'll shout together. They'll be quiet together. They'll stomp their feet together. They used to do the wave together. Why? Because they have a common mission. To do everything we can to see the Panthers win. And a common vision to see the Panthers walk off the field victoriously while the Packers are carried off in stretchers. That's the vision. Okay. And there is unity. That's why we could have 11 services and everybody understood we were one church. You want to worship this way, fine. You want to worship this way, fine. You want this kind of a service, fine. Some had an 1.5 hour service. Some had hours. That's fine. But we have a common mission, and our mission is to change the city of Denver for Jesus Christ. So, does that answer the question?
Well, I realize that so many of the congregation, they have no idea what's going on.
I know. Right now, they don't know what's going on. And no, this is not something you spring on the congregation overnight. But the congregation not only needs to hear the biblical basis for it, but they need to begin to hear the urgency for it. One of the things I've come to learn the hard way is that every time I cast vision, you've talked a lot about mission and vision, the vision frame. Every time I cast vision, I must create urgency. So I'm going to share with you my biggest failure as a leader. Okay? When I went to our region of churches in 1997, we cast a vision. Out of 220 churches, only 37 were growing. We cast a vision that in 5 years, under God's good hand, we would see 70% of our churches growing. We actually hit 72%. I'd never been with a Christian organization that achieved this vision. That was a new phenomenon. Now, our region had had a horrible experience with church planting because we didn't know how to do it. So I put a moratorium on church planting. At the end of the 5th year, when we hit that 70%, we had I guess you would call it a presbytery meeting, but we had our annual district meeting, and we went to Monterey, California for 2 days, and we had a fiesta. We had mariachis, we had piñatas, we ate Mexican food, and we sang, "Praise God from whom all blessings flow." God has turned our region around from a region that was ready to die to a region that's alive and vibrant. So the last presentation, I stood up and for 45 minutes waxed elephant. I said, here's what God has done. Now, it's now time to begin to plant churches. And after all, if we now have 150 growing churches, let's trust God to give us 150 churches in 10 years that will be new churches. Let's see if God will double the number of churches. And I cast the vision. Well, we were creating a new life cycle because we were making the change. We realized we were at the peak of our new life cycle. It's when you're at the peak that you start a new one. So I was casting a vision, we made a whole change, and all the pastors who had churches that broke the 200 barrier, most churches never break the 200 barrier, never get past average worship of over 200 all the time. And we had a bunch of churches, and so they would be mentoring all the other pastors. So I had about 20-some mentors, and I was training them, I was preparing them, I kept talking about church planning, church planning, church planning, church planning. Everything I talked about, everything we sent out was church planning. It's in March, and I've got the 20 mentors in front of me. And I'm standing in front of them waxing, again, really elephant about, we're going to be planting churches. The pastor who had been in the region the longest, he had been there for 37 years. In the last 5 years, his church had grown from 1,000 in worship to 1,700 in worship, and they had seen a bunch of people come to Jesus. And he stands up. Now, he was my E.F. Hutton. When he spoke, all the other pastors listened. So he just interrupted me. He didn't even ask. And he was that kind of a pastor. He just interrupted. He said, Paul, I want to say something. I said, okay. He said, I sense you want us to plant churches. And I felt like saying, duh. And then I remembered, everybody says, it takes a while. If it takes a while for pastors to get it, can you imagine how long it takes a congregation to get it? Okay. I said, yes, I do. He said, well, let me ask you this. You mean all these people we have worked so hard to get, we're supposed to give some of them away? And I felt like saying, that's what you tell people every Sunday when you take up the offering. All this money you've worked so hard to get, you're supposed to give some of it away. But I didn't say that. I said, yes. He said, well, you just need to know it's not going to happen. And he sat down. And I looked, and all 19 pastors were looking to him. They weren't looking at me. And at that point, I knew I wasn't the leader. He was the leader. Now, to be very honest with you, I thought, where's that business card, 1-800-call Guido? You know, I'd like to take him out. Be worth an investment. But I realized if that was going to be the response and the other pastors were going to follow, we would never plant churches. And what God taught me that year was I had been casting vision, but I had never been creating urgency. And you see, when people have a choice, here's the concept. When people have a choice between the status quo and a preferable future, that's what vision is. It's a preferable future. They will always choose the status quo, no matter how bad this is. And what you're doing when you're creating urgency, buddy, is you're making the status quo unacceptable. So that means there are a lot of people here. Oh, this is good church. I had people say, what do you mean all these problems? We don't have problems. Yes, you do. But they don't know about it. Many people haven't thought about the fact that what's God think when he looks at a church where the community has mushroomed and you're still piddling around with 300 or 400 people? Okay. I mean, God says, I will grow my church, and we're here to make disciples, and this church isn't making disciples. So you need to have some messages to the people that begin to create urgency. Say, this is something we got. Folks, this is a spiritual mandate. That's a message that needs to be going out from session members as you interact with people, as you talk to people. Yeah, there's some good stuff here, but folks, you don't know do you realize what's going on? I mean, it's almost like getting a fish to describe water. A fish can't describe water because they've been in it so long. Many of the older people here, they have very little experience with any other church. And this church is at least 300 or 400 people. We got decent facilities. We have air conditioning. The grass gets mowed. We have a cemetery to go to when we're done. I don't know how much urgency that, but you understand what I'm saying. And to say, no, folks, if you want to grade ourselves on the curve, we might give ourselves a C or a B. But if you look at God's standard, we're somewhere between D and F. And God doesn't want us to stay there. And so, yes, there has to be a way to talk about urgency for this. Okay? Does that help?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Yeah.
Dr. Borden, just looking at this first prescription, right? I guess from a practical point of view, it is a prescription, right? So it's intended, the first two paragraphs you mentioned different groupings
Right.
to be prescriptive, maybe not all-inclusive, but it's certainly not descriptive.
Yeah, I just picked some of the major tribes. Remember I said last night, I see tribe. But there, in those tribes, you've got some sub-tribes. Okay. And you've got, you've got Sunday school classes, I know, because I've been around churches long enough, that are fiefdoms. People have marked out their turf. Don't mess with us. At least the women's ministry's been clear about what their turf is. Don't mess with us. For a while, you had somebody marked out the kitchen as their turf. Again, this whole idea of this individualism. We're not a community. And the one thing this church is not a community of the people of God. It's like the Balkans. Okay. And part of this is to say, you want people to look back and say, you realize in 2021, when we did those series of meetings, that's when God called all of us. Nobody escapes, including pastor, including session, including staff. Nobody escapes. We've got to do this. And I want to tell you folks, when you do this, and you do it with sincerity, God shows up. It's amazing what God begins to do. Okay. All right? Let's go to concern number 2. Many people do not know what Bethel 200 means or its significance. Now, this concern is somewhat understandable since the implementation of the mission and vision were interrupted by the pandemic. I mean, just about the time, it took you forever to get there. I understand that, okay? But once you got there, all of a sudden, the world turns upside down. However, it is time to begin to add definition and description to the big picture of the mission and vision. Also, since the session has adopted this mission for the church, it is imperative that the ministries of the church be aligned with the mission and vision. I mean, that's the whole point of having a mission and vision, is to produce alignment. So, prescription. The pastor, staff, and session need to develop a change plan for 2021 that begins to put the meat on the bones of the vision frame. One of the questions I got most time is, what does this mean that's different from what we're doing now? And that's legitimate because a lot of the terms that are there don't have a lot of definition or description. I understand that. That's a legitimate question. However, the same people need to develop a transition plan to help the congregation deal with the losses that always happen with change. See, change is all about new beginnings. But every time you have a new beginning, for some people, it's a loss. So suppose you're going to another church, and you're sitting there Sunday morning, and after the end of the sermon, the pastor stands up before he or she gives the benediction. Says, folks, I don't know if you've noticed, but our church has been growing. Unlike most churches in our city, our church is growing. You get here late, it's hard to find a parking place. You get here late, you have to take the bad seats up front. It's just, we're growing. So we have decided 2 months from, this is the first Sunday of the month, 2 months from now, we're going to go to 2 services. We're going to have a service at this time, and we're going to have a service at this time. Now let's stand and sing the doxology because God's blessing our church. So you stand and sing the doxology. On the way out, the husband says to his wife, isn't it great? We drive past churches every Sunday getting here that aren't growing. Isn't it great our church is growing? And his wife says, I guess so. So it's Thursday evening. Dinner's over. The kids are off doing their homework. And the husband says, I've been thinking all week. He said, isn't it wonderful we're going to a church that's growing? His wife said, have you talked to our friends, the Johnsons? No, I haven't. Well, Barb Johnson and I, we've been talking. And because of the way they're going to do youth and Sunday school and all the other things that have to happen with 2 services, the Johnsons are going to have to go to the second service. Now, we can't go to the second service because we have that luncheon appointment at the country club every Sunday morning, 11:15, and that's much more absolute than God's word. Okay, we've got to be there. So we're going to have to go to the first service. Do you realize we're never going to see the Johnsons again? No, that's not true. But for the wife, the fact that she will not be in the service with her friend, even if her friend's sitting 3 pews in front of her, is a loss. Okay. And so one of the things that's part of change management is how do you help those who are experiencing the loss that comes with the changes? So I want to give you the classic illustration. Ron McCrary was rector at Overland Park Episcopal Church in Overland Park, Kansas. He went there, it was a church of about 200. He went there as a worship leader. The pastor died after he'd been there about 6 months, and Ron was made the pastor. I'd never planned on being a pastor, he was made the pastor. Now, Ron had not only an evangelical heart, he had an evangelistic heart. And he said, we have to start reaching people for Jesus. Well, after about 7 or 8 years, 10 years, whatever it was, the church had grown to 700, 3 services, every service being packed. And many of the newcomers were disenfranchised Roman Catholics that had come to know Jesus, and they could make the cultural transition into a Anglican service because it was a lot like a Roman Catholic service, and they could make that cultural transition. And Ron knew that they needed to grow, but he also, this was in the middle 90s, late 90s, he wanted to start a contemporary service. Now, for Ron, a contemporary service was to get a small, what you and I would probably call combo, that would do Roman Catholic charismatic praise songs that most Protestants had never heard of before. Because at that time there was a real charismatic movement in the Roman Catholic Church, and many of these people were coming to Jesus and they were off creating these songs. To do that, he knew that he had to put this music team up around the altar because there was no place else for them to be. But they had this marble altar that was, he said, as big as a sarcophagus that had been donated during the Depression, along with the stained glass windows and everything else in the church when the people mortgaged the homes to build the church. And now it's in the 90s. And Ron knew they had a change plan. But he said, I knew I needed a transition plan. So he said, I stood up on a Sunday morning and I said, folks, we've been trying to be a church where we say there are no boundaries to people. If you want to come to Jesus, there's no boundaries here. We just want you to come. But he said, folks, our church is not handicap accessible. We actually limit people with physical handicaps from coming to our church. There's no ramps. If you're on crutches, you have to navigate steps. If you're in a wheelchair and you have to go to the restroom, people have to literally pick you up and take you downstairs. Can you imagine how embarrassing that is? And he said, you could just hear people in congregation, oh. So for a whole year, they laid out the plan, what they wanted. He never said a word about the altar. But they laid out the whole plan. They did the capital campaign. They're raising funds. So they got ready to make the change. And on a Monday morning, a stonemason came in and he locked the doors. And the stonemason went up to the altar and cut it in half. The part they weren't going to use, he said to the stonemason, with your tools, slice that into as many thin slabs of marble as you can get. He said, we ended up with about 350 slabs of marble. And then he said, drill a hole through each one in the middle. Then he said, all week, the staff and I took all these slabs of marbles, we put a big red ribbon through the hole with a big red bow, with the gold seal of the church embossed in the middle of the bow. He said, that Saturday night, we had planned a dinner for all the original people of the church, the ones who had mortgaged their homes, who had helped build the church. Half of them had their names on stuff all through the building. You know, we just love to get our honor now rather than get to heaven, but we have those names there, okay? And it's all there. And they said, the rest of us served them. It was a great meal. And then for 2 hours, we told stories, talked about all the things. We thanked them for all they had done. And then he said, I said to them, as you know, we've had to make changes in the church. We realize we've got to change some of our music, and so we're going to do a contemporary service. And I had to take the altar and cut it in half. But the good news is, I have a piece of the altar for every one of you. And he gave out all those slabs of marble to all the people there. He said, if I had doubled that, someone would have taken 2 slabs. He said, I did not get one complaint about the altar. He said, the next 2 or 3 years when I would go visit in homes or invited to dinner, I'd walk in and there over the fireplace would be their piece of the altar. I'd go into the husband's office where, he had the vanity wall with all the degrees and stuff, and there would be a piece of the altar. If I had to go to the bathroom, I was upstairs, and I'd look over the bedroom and the bed in the master bedroom, and over the bed would be their piece of the altar. And when he told me this, it reminded me that summer I had been watching the baseball All-Star game that was the last All-Star game played at the old Yankee Stadium. Because that year it was going to be closed and the new Yankee Stadium would be open. And 2 or 3 times during the game, the announcers talked about how after every Yankee home game, the grounds crew had to go in and fill in holes where people had brought bags and put dirt in there to take home a piece of Yankee Stadium. In other words, what a transition plan helps you do is to help people validate this is a loss. We understand that. We want to recognize that and, if possible, even honor you for the loss. But the loss can't stop the change that has to happen to reach our community for Jesus Christ. So what I'm saying is, when I talk about this, is that as you think through the year, is to think through. So, for example, I met a number of people who were the settlers here, the ones who came to Christ under Dee Dee, the ones who are still here, the ones who say, we're losing our church, as though it's their church. I understand that, but we're losing our church. Man, I'd have a dinner for them. I'd honor them. I'd thank them. And I would help them see that they have created a legacy. That this new thing that they don't quite understand, they don't feel comfortable in, but they have a legacy. And that we want to see hundreds and hundreds of people come to. In fact, in our vision training, we said we want to see 200 in the next 9 years come to Jesus. And they get to be a part of that because they've created that legacy. So that's what I'm talking about. Now, again, this plan, the transition plan, I'm at the end of the first paragraph, needs to articulate change behaviors and dates. Included in this plan needs to be the implementation of a mission ministry audit. Such an audit will contain specific behaviors that will provide descriptions and definitions of some of the terms in the mission frame. Now, before I finish, please take your handout from last night and turn, I think it's page 9 I want. Yeah, page 9. Got a box on it that's divided into 4 quadrants, okay? You notice at the top, it's a mission ministry audit. The vertical line on the left is the focus of a ministry. It's either internal, meaning it's for us, or it's external, meaning it's for the people who aren't here yet, okay? The horizontal line on the bottom is the purpose of the ministry. It's to entertain or edify. Now, if you wonder by entertainment, church concerts are entertainment. Dinners are entertainment. Cheap entertainment, but it's entertainment, okay? On the other side, it's to equip or evangelize. And so what I'm saying you will do if you accept this prescription is you will go through every ministry of the church. Session, deacons, worship team, choir, adult Sunday school classes, small groups, men's ministry, women's ministry, youth, children's Sunday school, adult Sunday school. Go through every ministry in the church and start out by saying, which of the 4 boxes does this ministry fit into? Now, most of you can guess. Does anybody want to guess which of the 4 quadrants? Bottom left, okay? All the ministries, for the most part, and this is the same almost every church I work with. They're internal, they're for us, and they're to entertain or edify. Okay. Now, by the way, this is why most churches are dying, even if they have good mission statements, because most of the ministries of the church don't align with the mission statement. And one of the things you've said about your mission and vision frame is, we want something that is different in that it pushes us out to reach people out there. It's not just them coming to you. Hopefully they still come to you, but we also want to go out to them. So, what we have said to churches is when you look at this ministry, say, are you here? And they say, yeah, we're here. Say, all right, here's the deal. You need to show us what 3 things you're going to do in the next 12 months that put you in the upper right-hand box. Okay? In other words, what are you going to do that helps you align yourself to the mission? Okay? So, let me give you a couple of illustrations. I was working with a church about 5 years ago, church just about your size. They averaged about 300 in worship attendance. And they said, we want to have a mission and vision that's outward. So they began to do the audit of every ministry. Well, they got to the women's ministry. The women would do 10 things a year, about 1 every month, and they'd take 2 months off in the summer. And most of it was centered around food. You know, they'd have a tea or dinner or whatever. And they said, how many women come to these events? And when they examined, they found that every event, there are normally about 30 to 50 women, which in some churches you say, well, that's a good ministry. Until they asked, who are the women that are coming? And they said, well, they're either women from our church or women from other churches in the community. So the women's ministry was not doing anything to help make new disciples for Jesus. So they were not going to be aligned with the mission and vision. So they said to the women, what 3 things are you going to do in the next 12 months to help you do that? And it was interesting. The women said, well, we've thought about that. Here's what we're going to do. 3 times a year, once in the fall, once in the winter, once in the spring, our event's going to be a banquet. Okay, this is not going to be your typical church potluck, you know, the lime jello with a pear on the bottom and the green bean casserole. Okay, this is going to be, you know, silverware. We're going to cater it if we have to. And we're going to sell tickets. Now, the purpose of the tickets is not to cover the cost of the banquet because the tickets will be quite inexpensive. The purpose of the tickets is you cannot get into the banquet if you don't have a ticket. However, when you come to the 3 or 4 women who will be selling the tickets, we're telling you before you do this, you cannot buy 1 ticket. You must buy 2 tickets and give her the name of the woman who doesn't go to church that you've already invited to the banquet. In other words, your way to get into the banquet is to bring somebody who doesn't normally go to church. Because when the banquet is over, the dinner part is over, we're going to invite a guest speaker, maybe from our church, a guest speaker from another church, and she will come in and she's going to talk about her faith relationship with Jesus. And maybe even invite the women there who don't have a relationship with Jesus to be willing to follow Jesus Christ. So what they were saying was 7 times a year, what we do is down here in the bottom left, it's for us. It's down the bottom left-hand box. But 3 times a year, it's not for us. It's for the people who don't know Jesus yet. About 10 years ago, I was in a Presbyterian church here further south. I'm not going to tell you which state, but further south. There's not too many beyond that, but further south. Had been a church of 500. It was down to about 60 people. Average age was in the low 70s. The church was getting to the point where they often couldn't afford their facilities. They said, do you think we can grow? We said, well, do you want to put the Great Commission first? They said, we do. I said, all right. You got to do the audit. Well, they still had 2 adult Sunday school classes left. The first class had been meeting for 65 years. And when it started, it was called the Young Marrieds class. Okay. When they did, and there were about, 70, 80 people in it. When they did the audit, there were 10 people ages 75 to 85. Attrition had occurred. Okay. And this class hadn't helped make a new disciple for Jesus in years. And so they went to the class. And they said, what are you going to do? And here's what the class said. We've been thinking about this because you've talked about it. Most of us are physically incapable of getting to church on our own. People pick us up, take us to church, take us home. So we can't be like the women's class. But they said, here's what we'll do every Sunday. As every other ministry in the church is reaching out to people who don't know Jesus. If you give us 5, 10, 15 names of people who don't know Jesus, we will stop prime time in our class and pray for all these people by name and pray that the Spirit of God will convict of sin, righteousness, and judgment, and that God will bring these people to himself. I don't know if you've ever thought about it. Most of the prayers in church are to keep people out of heaven. We keep asking God to heal them. Nothing wrong with that. But where in church do you pray for people who don't know Jesus? I've worked with enough churches. I see this every week at our church. We have 2 ladies who do a great job of gathering all the prayer requests, and we send out an email list with all the prayer requests. And almost every prayer request is either for somebody to get better or for someone who's grieving over death, which is fine. But there's nobody saying, God, we want to pray for lost people. And this class said, we will do that. I was teaching this about 3 or 4 years ago. And when it took a break, I had a youth pastor come up to me. He said, Paul, oh, I do this all the time. He said, now, I have about 100 senior high in the youth program. He said, I got about 6 high schools represented. So he said, every Sunday I go up to 3 of my students, all from different high schools. And I said, I want to come to your school this week on Tuesday. I want to buy your lunch. I want to buy your lunch on Wednesday. I want to buy your lunch on Thursday. And you can invite up to 10 of your friends and I'll buy their lunch. But here's the condition. You cannot invite any of your friends who go to church with you. You have to invite friends you know who do not go to church at all. He said every Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, I'm having spiritual conversations with teenagers who don't know Jesus, who are coming to Jesus, and I'm training my youth to help them know how to talk about Jesus. Every ministry. How are you going to do this? Now, having said that, let me finish reading and then I'll see what questions you have. So, I'm in the second paragraph and I'm at the third sentence. The purpose of the audit is to help every ministry understand what it actually means to be aligned with the mission. It will also determine who is willing to join the mission and the consequences for those who resist being part of the mission adopted by the session. In other words, here's the deal. If you have a ministry, they said, we're not going to do this. Really? Okay. Well, then there's one of two choices. We're either going to ask your ministry to shut down, or you can meet, but recognize we're not going to put any announcements in our e-blasts. We're not going to promote the ministry. If you don't be part of the mission and vision, so I'll take one as an example. If the women's ministry says, we've been doing this for years, we're not changing. Okay. But then don't ask us to name honorary people during the worship service. If you don't want to be part of the mission and vision, see, it's not whether we like you or not. It's not what your age is. It's not whether you've been here a long time. The issue is, are you going to be part of the mission and vision? Or you're not going to be part of the mission and vision? We want to give everybody the opportunity, and we'll let you and help you find ways to do it that fit who you are and what your age is and what your interests are. But everybody needs to be part of the mission and vision. Or this is the thing that's going to join us together. And you constantly bring every discussion back to the mission and vision. That's the whole purpose of having the vision frame. Okay? So, next paragraph. The leaders will help the congregation comprehend that unity in a congregation is not everyone being in the same room having fellowship with one another. Unity is a group of people with different personalities, gifts, talents, interests, passions, etc., working together for a common goal or mission. That is why an articulated mission statement is crucial and why it needs to be implemented and not just be words on paper. Finally, the leaders need to adopt an evangelistic strategy that will first be embraced and understood by the leaders, and then implemented by both leaders and individual congregational participants to help the entire congregation become obedient to the Great Commission. All this should be accomplished by December 31, 2021, because it will take you all year to do this. So, what I mean by evangelistic strategy, many of the eco-churches I'm working with have adopted Alpha. And the first time they do Alpha, they say all session members go through Alpha, all deacons go through Alpha, and anybody else that's in the church wants to go through Alpha. Why? Just to help people learn what Alpha is, to create an evangelistic curriculum so that the next time you do Alpha, Alpha only works if you invite unbelievers to be involved. Okay? And now Alpha has adapted it so it can be done in Zoom and done all kinds of ways digitally. Okay. I don't know if you ever thought about it, but since the end of World War II, 1945, now to 2020, never in the Christian church has there been so much available to Christians in terms of books, Bible translation, curriculum, videos, teaching, training. And in the midst of all of these resources, the church is dying. If you want to reach unchurched people, number one, you got to understand, they're not going to give you 2 hours on Sunday. They're not going to come to Sunday school. You'll get them for 1 hour. And they'll give you another hour during the week, but they're not going to come to Sunday school. But I want to tell you, for all these churches that talk about how Sunday school is, it's amazing how all the dedication you have to Sunday school here is not changing the whole spirituality of your church. Because most Sunday school classes is to put stuff here and it never gets to here. And that's why you have to have alpha and things like that to say, how do we take what we know and make it work? It's very interesting. I've had our adult person at Malibu created what we call a discipleship cohort, where 1 week you study the Bible and the next week you actually do something where you do it. And the next week you study another piece, and they're actually now putting a list together of unchurched people they don't know. They're practicing how they're going to share with those unchurched people. They're doing all the, and it's, you know who's been the biggest resistant to it? It's the people who teach the Sunday school and the Bible studies. Because they say you're undermining what we're doing. And I said, wait a minute, it doesn't make any sense. Okay. So the purpose of this prescription is to begin to say, what are you going to do to help us achieve the mission? Questions you want to ask on concern number 2 and prescription number 2. Okay. Let's go to concern number 3. The congregation is not structured for growth. There are a number of reasons why the congregation has continually struggled with growing in an area that has experienced explosive growth. Some of which include sin. We've talked about that. Poor leadership. Sometimes that's been from pastors, sometimes it's been from sessions, sometimes it's been a combination of the two. Philosophies of ministry that work against growth. If you want someone who's a good preacher and who's going to visit everybody, the church will never get past 400 or 500. Reason why most churches don't get past 200 is because that's all one pastor can handle. You've had some exceptional pastors. But that's a philosophy of ministry that works against growth. Okay. By the way, people should be cared for. In our turnaround with our churches, we got rid of the word pastoral care because that's unbiblical. That ought to get a few deer in the headlight looks. Ephesians chapter 4. Apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, teachers, those 5 gifted people are to equip the saints to do the work of ministry. The problem with most pastors, the problem with most staff people in churches is they think it is their job to do the ministry. It is not their job. You need a youth pastor. You need a children's pastor. You need whatever. Who's like Tom Sawyer. Aunt Polly told him to whitewash the fence. Tom didn't want to whitewash the fence. So he got everybody else to do it. And he got the credit. Paul Nixon planted 2 churches in Florida, in the panhandle of Florida. The first church he planted, when they got to about 70 to 100 people, they got ready to build a facility. They did not build a church building, they built a community center. And Monday through Saturday, starting out with all the retirees, came in for crafts and games and all the other stuff retirees do. And they did their fishing for men and women and had a nice big building to meet in on Sunday. Paul told me, he said, the first church got to 1,000. And they planted another church that also got to 1,000. He said, when we planted to 1,000, we had all ages represented, not just seniors. We had empty nesters, we had young marrieds. In fact, he said we had 100 youth in the youth program. He said, but the youth program began to decline, and we got down to about 75 young people. And so he said, I knew I needed to get a new youth pastor. So he said, I got a new youth pastor, and I got this 23-year-old kid sitting in front of me. And he said, now around here, we expect you to set goals. Kid says, I have a goal. He said, what's your goal? He said, my goal is in 12 months to get the youth program back to 100. It's now 75. I want to get us back where we were. Paul said, well, that's a good goal. He said, how many people do you have helping you do the youth ministry? And the kid said, well, if I count singles as a unit and married couples as a unit, I've got 8 units. He said, well, rather than setting a goal to go from 75 to 100, I want you to set a goal to increase the number of units of people helping you do the youth ministry. And the kid said, okay. And he just kind of sat there. And Paul said, well, pick a number, set a goal. So the kid thought, and he said, 40 units. Paul said, I would have gladly accepted 18. He said, next year there's 40 people I can phone, call, email, and say, you're part of the kid said, that's right. He said, why'd you pick 40? He said, well, Jesus liked that number. I just thought it was a good number. Okay. All good youth pastors are one bubble off. You know? I can say that. My son was youth pastor for 10 years. That's why it took him 10 years, literally, to get his bachelor's degree. He was a youth pastor. A year later, this kid had 40 units, and there were 250 youth in the youth program. Churches grow as you multiply groups and as you multiply leaders. Okay. And so leadership is crucial. Anyway, I'm reading second sentence, some of which include sin, poor leadership, philosophy of ministry that work against growth, and the way the congregation is structured. That's what we're talking about. The area of traditional Presbyterian polity is such an obstacle, that ECO is desiring that all their congregations find a new way of being structured that still fits Presbyterian theology, but enables a mission and vision to succeed and be effective. All church polities, or all church governing structures, you basically have 3: congregational, elder, which is Presbyterian, and bishop, which would be Roman Catholic, Salvation Army. The general in London can shut down a Salvation Army church in the outback of Australia. That's better than the Pope can do in terms of authority. Okay. But all of them are based far more on the Magna Carta and the U.S. Constitution than the Bible. I mean, if you look at how decisions were made in the book of Acts, it's hard to find how they function. I mean, you realize in Acts 1, when they want to pick somebody to take Judas' place, they cast lots. They basically play Yahtzee and say, who's going to be the next one? Okay. In Acts 6, the apostles lay out the criteria and then said, you pick. They got to fit the criteria, but you pick. In Acts 15, at the end of the Jerusalem Council, James, not the apostle, but the brother of Jesus, makes the decision. Paul says to Titus, you go back to Crete, your home area, and you appoint elders. Most people now believe that in Acts 22, when Paul met with the Ephesian elders, these were not boards of elders. It was all the elders from Ephesus, where there were, by 100 AD, 200 house churches. Okay. The New Testament does not talk about the structure. And so ECO says, we've got to find a structure that works. And here's why. Notice the last 2 sentences. The concept is to marry 3 terms that are often kept separate in most congregations. Those congregations are responsibility, authority, and accountability. So you give someone the responsibility for Christian ed, then you have a Christian ed committee. They have the authority. You have a youth pastor who's responsible for youth. You put a youth committee over him. Tell him when he or she can get the keys to the van. And nobody holds anybody accountable because they don't know what to hold people accountable for. Okay. And so as ECO says, that's stupid, and it really is. So, prescription. Adopt the accountable model of leadership and set session criteria. The session and staff need to read the book Winning on Purpose by Dr. John Kaiser. Some of you may have heard of a Harvard professor called John Carver, who did a whole study of nonprofit boards and found that nonprofit boards have the same problem church boards, sessions have. And John took Carver's work, which was for nonprofits, and made it work for the church. Okay? And I'm having the elders at Malibu, we're almost finished reading the book now, and we're going to adopt this structure probably by the end of the year, because we want a pastor who's going to come in, and we want a pastor who's going to be looking to say, how do I lead a church where we marry responsibility, authority, and accountability? Okay. So, prescription. You read the book by John Kaiser. It's the next sentence. The session and staff also need to follow the teaching of John Terrick, who I think you have coming here already. Is that right? Okay, John Terrick, the COO of ECO, about the accountable model of leadership. In other words, what John's going to teach you is the same thing that John's saying in the book. But I'm going to give you an overview of it. The session governs. Now, nobody knows what that means. I'll talk about that in a minute. But the session governs, and in the process, holds the pastor accountable. Many of you talked about holding the pastor accountable. I believe the pastor should be held accountable, but the question is, accountable for what? By the way, I worked under this model, and our churches in Northern California worked under this model for 12 years. I kept my job by being accountable for goals. And if 2 years went by and I didn't keep accounting for goals, it was understood I left. Okay? There was no debate, you just leave. Okay? I held my staff accountable, but I was held accountable by my board, which would be like the session. The pastor leads, and the pastor holds the staff accountable. You can't have multiple bosses. Okay? The staff equips, that's Ephesians 4, and the congregation does ministry. This model moves the session from management. You spend most of your meetings as Presbyterians, I've been in enough eco churches, managing, which, by the way, in Acts 6 was the work of deacons. Now, in Presbyterian circles, deacons have become care people, and the session does the management, but nobody's acting like elders. Okay? And allows them to govern and genuinely act as elders. So let me talk about what governance means in this model. If I were to coach you through this model as a session, I would say up here you have your mission and vision. And I'm working this way right now with the session at Malibu. And I'm saying to them, by the way, our session has been very honest. We did the mission document for a new pastor, and they let me actually put in, I wrote a red letter edition after they had written it. And basically we said, our mission and vision hasn't informed anything we've done the last 15 years. It doesn't inform what we're doing, okay? And so we said, we want a new pastor to come in and to help us achieve a mission that will cause us to focus on the Great Commission. It's been interesting the kinds of pastors you attract when you actually say that, okay? So, assuming your mission is, in a sense, to do the Great Commission, is to say what 3 to 5 major things have to happen every year. So at the end of the year, you can say, we have achieved this part of our mission and vision this year. Okay? So, for example, I would argue, if you're going to be serious about the Great Commission, evangelists have to be happening every year. That's a major thing. Number 2, leadership development has to be happening, because if you're not developing leaders, you're not going to achieve anything. Okay. Number 3, you probably want discipleship to be happening, meaning as people come to Christ, they're going to be developed and taught to reproduce. Because we want mature disciples. We don't want immature disciples. We want mature. They actually can reproduce. And I would say at least number 4, and this is a high value for Malibu, I think it's a high value for you, we want to see our community change. Now, we have said our community is near, here, and far. So there's the community in the area where most of our people come from, and then there's the community which would be Los Angeles and Santa Monica and all of that, and then there's the world. That's our community. So we have, in our case, probably what I call the 4 big rocks. So what happens at the beginning of the year is session and your pastor would sit down and establish goals that are measurable, that are specific in those 4 areas. This week I was actually in Merced, California, working with a church that has adopted this structure, helping them set goals. So, our pastors in Northern California, for example, would say, all right, this year, you've got about 300 people, say, around, Sunday, you got maybe more, but say 300 round number. We'd like to see 10% of our population become brand new disciples of Jesus Christ. So that means we'd like to see 30 people come to Christ. Now, some of them may be children. Some of them may be teenagers. I mean, that we may have some baptisms because you consider that coming to Christ, confirmation, people coming to Christ, but we want some adults too. So if that's the goal, 30. We would like to develop 20 new leaders this year. Okay. We want to see 10% of our people who are now not active in any service endeavor in the church, now active in doing something. We want to see discipleship that actually produces something. Okay. And what I said to the church in Merced is, count up all the people you touched last year in the community. Now that would be, for us in Malibu, that would include Haiti. How many people did you touch? Rescue Mission, how many people did you touch? You probably touched 3,000 or 4,000 people last year. All right, this year, is it going to be 5,000? 4,500? You set that goal, okay? Now, once you set those goals, that's the first part of governance, okay? Second part of governance is you tell the pastor ahead of time what he and the staff and the session cannot do. Not what they can do, but what they can't do. In other words, you set up boundaries. And normally you set boundaries in 5 areas. It's the areas that everybody worries about. Okay? Theology. Now, ECO's already set the boundaries for you. Okay, but nobody can go out. If we find a Sunday school teacher who's teaching something against the major tenets of ECO, then they cannot be a Sunday school teacher. Okay? If we have a session member who takes a position, if the pastor preaches something that's against, we've got to work with that. So you got theology. Number 2 is morality. Okay? Generally that means sexual morality, but it can mean financial morality. It can be telling the truth, integrity, that kind of thing. Number 3 is financial. So I work with churches that say no one on staff and no session member can have a credit card that's not paid off at the end of every month. Another financial boundary is every budget must be balanced without, if we want an imbalanced budget, then that's a special decision that session has to make. Okay. By the way, in this model, the pastor is responsible for the budget. You don't have a finance committee. All the committees go away on this. Okay. Why? Because if the pastor is going to be held accountable for goals, the pastor has to be able to allocate the resources to make sure the pastor has the resources to achieve those goals. So I was responsible for the budget. Now I'm a liberal arts major, so I don't know anything about figures. So I got some pretty good financial people around me to actually do the budget. But I had 3 boundaries. I could not create an unbalanced budget without getting board approval. I could not create a balance. I could not take out of savings to balance the budget. It had to be cash flow. And number 3, if we were growing, I could project a 10% income in growth next year, but I could not project 11%. I could have faith, but I couldn't be presumptuous. Okay? Those are boundaries. Now, once the boundaries are set, the pastor and the pastor's staff can run any place they want to without going out of bounds. So, if they decide they want to start another service, they can. They don't have, now, if they're wise, they will talk to it about session. But that's not session's business. Your business is to hold them accountable and to make sure they don't get out of bounds. By the way, in our churches, our boards or sessions only met about 4 times a year, because this moves the business of the church to staff meetings, not to session meetings. Why? Because you're marrying responsibility with authority, and the pastor is holding the staff accountable for specific goals. So the pastor's job is to break down the goals in each areas and say to staff, all right, how many are you going to take for Sunday school, children's Sunday school? How many kids you want to see come to Jesus? Jeremy, how many kids you want to see in the youth group? Okay, etc. So I'm just giving you an overview. I know there's going to be a lot of questions where I'm going into, but that's, so the session governs, the pastor leads, the staff equips, the congregation does ministry. Now, that also means that during the year, if you're in session, you're all given dark glasses because you are Secret Service personnel for the pastor and the staff. And when anyone complains about the staff, you protect the staff. Say, look, as long as they're in bounds and as long as they're meeting their goals, you may not like the way it gets done, but we just want to make sure they stay in bounds and they keep the goals. It's a whole different way of functioning, but here's what my pastors, when I was running the region, my pastors, they're God's pastors, but the pastors, they said to me, said, Paul, I've never been so free and I've never been so accountable. Because every year, in fact, our annual meetings at our region, I actually had one pastor say the teenagers love to come to our annual meetings because it's all about what we accomplished, not what we did. Okay? So, last big paragraph. With this change, there must be clearly articulated qualifications that follow both Timothy and Titus that demands all elders be aligned with the mission and vision and be generous in supporting the finances of the church. I would say all elders need to be committed to the mission and vision, or they shouldn't be elders. All elders should be at least tithing. That's the cheapest part of generosity. It also means that elders must model the behaviors expected from those in the congregation. That's why the elders need to go through the Alpha class and say, all right, we're going to be inviting unsaved neighbors to the next Alpha class. We're going to model it for the congregation. Being an elder is a leadership position. Therefore, elders must lead in character, theology, and behaviors. This new structure and criteria need to be in place by the end of 2021. And ECO can give you answer a lot of these questions that you may have from this, but that's what they're going to be here for, to help you with. And the book, Winning on Purpose, will answer a lot of the questions. Now,
I'll indulge just one thing.
yeah.
So when Paul says we've invited John Tarrick, I have the task force that you all appointed, Officer Development. He is speaking by Zoom with that. When I read this, I wanted you all to hear it. But on the 30th of this month, John Tarrick we've got a planned Zoom meeting at 7 o'clock with that task force. Given this, I'm going to kind of reverse this order and say, this is now for you. And the task force will kind of listen in. But with this being a prescription to that level, you all need to, before you say yes to this, you've got to know what it is.
Yeah, you got to know what you're buying.
So I'm going to send tomorrow, be on the lookout for a link to church governance. The task force already has it. It's going to take you a few hours to process, okay? So don't think you can do this on the hour before the meeting with John Tarrick. It's going to take you a few hours to listen to it, process it, and then I expect you to come to that meeting with 2 or 3 big questions. I'll give you all of the same stuff I've given to the development team task force, I'm now going to give to you all, because it's a prescription, which means really it's not up to the task force anymore. It's your decision.
Okay. By the way, John has a good interview on that.
Yeah, he does a great interview. Yeah.
Actually, he interviewed me, so that's why I was saying that. Okay. All right, let me deal with the fourth one, because I'm going to end on time, and then I'll hang around if you have questions you want to ask, etc. Concern number 4, there's a lack of training of elders and staff. The elders do not know how to be elders and what is expected of them. The same is true of the staff. Also, there is no strategy for the development of leaders in the congregation. However, this last issue cannot be addressed currently until elders and staff understand what it means to be leaders. Now, one of the things I've said to all over the country, to pastors and session members, etc., is this. Number one, there are leadership positions. So, as your pastor, Tom is in a leadership position. You all, as session members, are in a leadership position, okay? That does not make you or me a leader being in a leadership position, okay? Number two, there are leaders. I define a leader as someone who has either a natural talent for leadership, because you don't have to be a Christian to be a leader, or has a spiritual gift of leadership. And I would argue that no more than 10% of the people in the Church of Jesus Christ in our nation are leaders. So the question comes, if I'm part of the 90%, which is good odds all of us are maybe part of that 90%, I'm in a leadership position, but I'm not a leader, what am I to do? And here's what we said to our pastors, because most of our pastors were not leaders. You need to learn leadership behavior. When Paul said to Timothy, do the work of an evangelist, most of the commentaries believe Timothy did not have the gift of evangelism, but he was to do the work of an evangelist. Most pastors do not have the gift of leadership. But if you're in a leader position, you have to learn what leadership behavior is. Learning how to recruit is a leadership behavior. I've already heard it's hard to recruit people around here. Now, part of that's the culture, but it's also part of the problem of the leader. If I can't recruit, then I shouldn't be a leader. Okay, I've got to learn how to do that. Okay, I've got to learn how to confront. I've got to learn how to have not only a change plan, but a transition plan. Those are leadership behaviors that we don't know if we're not taught those. So here's the prescription. The first 30 or 45 minutes of each session and staff meeting needs to be training that is conducted by the pastor. This means that session may need to rearrange how session meetings are conducted. The same may be true for staff meetings. By the way, I've heard, I don't have time. We don't have time for that. If you don't have time for it, it doesn't matter what you're going to talk about anyway, because you're not going to handle it well unless you learn what it means to act like a leader. Also, twice a year, the session and staff need to experience some kind of leadership learning together. Just so you know, since I've been at Malibu, in May and in September, our staff and our session all watched. Now, the nice thing about digital learning is you don't have to watch it when it's live. You can watch it later. The leadership training that was provided by John Emery White at Mecklenburg Community Church. Okay. He talks about what should a church look like? How do you reach millennials? How do you reach Generation Z? How do you reach people who come and have no idea who Jesus is? How do you do virtual services? And because we did that learning together, we weren't learning how to be a megachurch. We're just trying to learn from people who know how to be leaders what to do, okay? Most elders have no idea what a healthy congregation looks like. Some of that is also true for staff members. Leadership training needs to become a high value. So, for example, of all the ministries your church does, here are the 3 ministries that must be focused on the most. Okay? These are the ministries that if you want to reach unchurched people, will help you reach them the most. The ministries of your church. These are the ones you're already doing. Okay? I call them the growth engines of the church. Number 1, Sunday morning worship. I would run the traditional service, not just for the people who want traditional service. I would run the service for people who want that, who don't know Jesus. Okay. You need to have the best traditional service you can have. You need to have the best worship cafe you can have. And by the way, here's the most important ingredient, is that guests have to be treated like guests. You have to understand, you don't change who you are, you don't change your message, but you do it because you always realize you've got company. As I said last night, when my wife and I would have company over, we act differently. Okay. In fact, my wife goes spastic because I'm just saying, just put the hot dogs out there. No. You don't do it that way. We have company. Okay? That's what people are looking. People are not looking for you to give them what you think they want, but people are looking for you to honor them as company. That's number one. Number two is connecting people who are new to the church. Bethel has not disappointed me. I've done over 700 intense church consultations, and I have yet to meet the second friendliest church in town. Every church I meet tells me it's the friendliest church in town. Now, I am convinced you're probably friendlier than most, because I've heard enough stories. But everybody believes they're the friendliest church in town. But here's the point, folks. You don't get credit for being the friendliest church in town, particularly with unchurched people. And here's why. They expect you to be friendly. So you don't get points for being friendly. You get demerits if you're not. It's like when my son was 5, he said, "Dad, can I have an allowance for brushing my teeth?" I said, "No. That's something you just do." Okay? When people walk into your church, they're not looking for a friendly church, they're looking for friends. And most people have no idea how to make friends, and most churches have no idea how to help people to make friends. Which is why your connection ministry is crucial. Whatever you call it, it's crucial. That's the second growth engine. If you can help people make friends, people will come. Third growth engine. Children, not youth. In the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, you could grow a church with a good youth group. But in 2020, it's children. Children rule. You know they rule because you can tell by attendance when Little League starts. You can tell by attendance when soccer leagues start. When I work with churches in Canada, you can tell when hockey leagues start. If the child wants to get somewhere, the parents get them there, and because they're helicopter parents, they hover. Which means that not Sunday school, because they're not going to give you 2 hours. The most important children's ministry is what happens when you're doing your worship services. That's where you put and here's the criteria. Children must be so important that kids go to school when they can get back to school. This is pre-COVID, that when kids go to school, they brag about it. And when that happens, other kids will want to come and their parents will get them here. Last story, and then I'm done. Little church, Wesleyan church, 20 miles from the Canadian border on the edge of the Adirondack Mountains. Started in the 1840s. Wesleyans were abolitionists. It was part of the Underground Railroad. There was a town there when the church started. When we did a consultation with them about 7 years ago, there's no town. There's just broken down barns, the church building there, and the average worship attendance every week was 20, and the average age was 75. And we actually did the weekend to determine whether they would live or die. And at the end, about halfway through, we said, "Well, what do you want to do?" They said, "We don't want to die." We said, "Well, folks, you are. I mean, if you do nothing," they said, "We'll do whatever you tell us." We said, "Okay, here's what you do. Anytime you have a choice between what is best for you and best for the community, you do what is best for the community." I said, "Okay." We said, "Let's test it." Now, all they had was a little foyer that was nothing much more than an extended cloakroom, and the worship center sat about 80. And they were convinced that the worship center was the Holy of Holies. And we said, when younger people walk in today, they want a cup in one hand and something to eat in the other. And I reminded them, when Jesus died, the curtain got cut in half. You can take coffee in now. It's okay. They weren't even sure they wanted communion in case somebody would spill something. They said, well, we don't have any room in the cloakroom. We said, all right, what's left? These old people literally put a coffee bar on the side of their worship center. It's the only church I know where you can actually smell the coffee. Second, they had a fellowship hall behind the church, and the policy was you could only use the fellowship hall if you were a member. Well, they only had 12 members, and most of them were in their 80s. Sometimes a whole year go by, nobody used a fellowship hall. So one Sunday they voted, because that's the way Wesleyans do it, that any civic group in the community that wanted to could use the fellowship hall. Now, if you ever grew up in a small town, you'll understand this. That afternoon, the head of the county government called the church and said, we hear you voted to join the community. Third thing, there was a McDonald's about 35 miles away that was renovating. They went to McDonald's. They said, you have something we want. We don't have enough money, a lot of money, so we want to buy it from you since you're going to probably throw it away. So now when you walk into church, in the foyer, there's this little narrow desk with a big sign that says, register your child, because if you don't demonstrate you have child safety, unbelievers are not going to give you their kids. So you register the child. Say, well, where's the child go? They say, you see that big round hole? That's the slide to the basement. That's what they bought from McDonald's. The slide to the basement. In 1 year, in the middle of nowhere, this church grew from 20 to an average attendance over 70, with young couples coming, kids coming, because it was known in the county as the church with the slide. And because the kids wanted to go to the church with the slide, the parents got them there and then hovered in the worship service and met Jesus. Worship, connection, and children are crucial if you want to grow. And that's why there needs to be training to understand what's church like today. You've seen the report. I realize it's up to you as to what you want to do. I'm convinced, folks, your best days can be in front of you. But it's going to take some hard choices if you want to be healthy. If you do, I've seen time after time where God shows up, and it's amazing what God does. I'm going to close in prayer, and we'll be done. Our Heavenly Father, thank you again for the women and men who are here. Thank you for their investment of time to come out 2 nights, to spend this kind of time to talk about the church. Thank you for their concern, their interest, their desire. Thank you for all the time that was spent on the mission frame. Thank you for this task force that's talking about structure. But Father, help all of us to understand that all this stuff doesn't matter if our heart is not right with you. And I pray that first of all, the hearts of the pastor and staff and session will be right with you, because they're the leaders. It's got to start with them. And that you will give them your wisdom and your passion to lead this congregation that sometimes are like the children of Israel that just grumble and grumble and grumble no matter where they are. To understand they're just not looking at the right stuff. That the mission and vision you have of reaching this city and this world and this community for Jesus is where the excitement is and what brings life and vitality to your people. May that happen here for their sake and for your glory. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you, folks.
Thank you.
Okay.
Question?
Pardon?
Question?
Sure. Yeah, you all leave, but if you want to listen to questions, that's fine. Go ahead, Jenny.
Is this an all or none restrictions for these 4 things? And how do we do it?
Well, I would say it is, from my perspective, I think you're foolish, not you, but I mean the church, if you don't work on all of them. Today, I found out that your pastor is entering into a relationship with a coach that a lot of eco pastors have worked with. He has done this, so he's not speaking from theory. and you're going to have somebody who will walk alongside you. I am willing anytime that anybody wants to call to tell you what I think. Obviously, that we all like to do that, but I'd be willing, to help any way I can. But you've got a coach who knows it, who's led pastors through that, and that is crucial to what's happening.
And then the other question is on the prescription, is it all or none? With this body, is it all or none?
Well, I say if the session says it's all or none, then you've made a decision for the body. You're Presbyterians. And they need to hear that.
But what if I say, I can't do this?
I would say when I think you ought to have a decision on this as a session, and let's suppose the decision is 10-5. 10 to do it and 5 don't. I would hope the 5 people who vote against it have the integrity to get off session. Can't make them, but hopefully they have the integrity. If they're not committed to this is all to help you do the vision frame. And you've invested time, you've invested thousands of dollars, and to sit back and say, no, we're just going to still fight over this. If that's the case, then if I were in somebody's shoes, I'd go find another church. Because this is not going to happen here if you fight over it. Does that answer the question or not? Okay. All right. Okay.
Paul, is an option, and you and I have talked about it, so I'm just going to float it out as a question, I want your answer. And I guess it could be session's decision, but let's say we get to it and it's a split. Or there's a negative that said no. Most of the folks in here said we're not going to do this. What does that say? What is that in your interpretation? What is that saying?
Well, in my opinion, that says we just kind of want to keep limping along. It's going to be business as usual.
So would one option at that point be that the session could then plant a new church of people who say, we're going to do this?
Well, if that happens, I mean, take a worst case scenario. So you're asking me to speak hypothetically, but I would say first of all, I assume if it's no, if I were on session and voted no, I would hope the people who would want it would leave. Because if they stay, it's going to just be continual friction. But they need to understand that if those people do it, you could lose 1/3 to 50% of your people. Okay. Now, I have no problem with larger churches, and I'm not saying church splits, but I would also say I'm speaking me personally. I don't want to be around churches that are disobedient. I mean, I have deliberately kept my membership because I move around anyway, so I'm in a church different. But I keep my membership at the church in our region that continually sees the most number of people come to Jesus every year, because I'm getting eternal dividends for my dollars. And that's what concerns me. Okay? Somebody have a hand up?
No, I was waving a button.
Okay, that's fine. Okay.
Hey, Dr. Borden.
Yeah.
So we've gone through a period of time here, and you've interviewed a number of people. And I assume these groups of people that you interviewed probably asked why you're here, or what we're trying to accomplish. And I'm assuming the people out there that were interviewed are also going to be expecting something from us. Do you have a recommendation in terms of what we communicate and when? Or do we need to all decide on the prescriptions and moving forward? And then we just say, well, the session met, we voted, unanimous or whatever, we're moving forward or we're not. I'm just kind of...
Well, I would say, however you vote, I would say to them, folks, we have been given prescriptions as a session, we have to make a decision. Once we make a decision, you can see the report, whether we agreed with it or disagree with it. You can see it. That's it. It's not going to hurt one way or the other. I mean, it will give you far more credibility to say, we're not hiding anything. But you need to know, as a session, we felt that Paul was too stringent and we're not going there. Or we're going to take this and we're going to do 1 and 3 or 2 and 4. Just lay it out there. But I will tell you, there will be far worse consequences if they never see it. I think they will understand, we've seen it, we have to think about it, we pray about it. Here's the deadline, we will make a decision by this deadline, and then you can see what he gave you. That's my suggestion.
Thank you.
Okay, all right?
Is there anything specific that we should know as a session from the conversations that you had?
Well, where I was doing individual conversations, I promised confidentiality. But in terms of specific, I mean, I heard everything from I wish the pastor would leave to we have a bunch of people in this church who are always complaining they need to leave. I mean, those were the extremes. So I heard everything in there. I heard it's, what's happening to our church. I've heard others say, I was amazed at the number of older people. I mean, I'm 76, and, with some of them, I could have been the youth pastor, but I was amazed at the number of the older people that said, we need to see something happen. We want to see something. We want to go somewhere. We want to do this. And it wasn't just an age thing. Now, you don't have a lot of younger people per se, but I've come to realize that there are some younger people that don't want to see this happen. Okay. But in terms of anything specific, other than the fact, no. But I will say this: for those who don't like the direction, the mission frame, and whatever, all that. For those who don't like the direction, there is with them greater distrust of session and staff and Tom, etc. Now, how much of that is colored by the fact that they don't like it, and how much it is what their perceptions is? I went through a number of specific questions with Tom and said, is this true? Is this true? And a number of those things were not true. Okay? And so those were specific accusations that many of them were made about him and whatever. And I said, is this true? Because I do that all the time with the pastor. And I've done this enough to know that as you whisper down the lane, the stories get more, and they get more forceful. Yeah, this has actually happened at that point. But no, nothing in terms of something specific that I think you all need to know. You just need to know that right now there are camps or tribes out there that don't agree.
And I guess that's what I was wondering, if you heard specifics that we as elders needed to know, like if it was trust or,
Well,
when they say they don't trust, what does that mean?
Well, the assumption is that you hide things. The assumption is that you shade the truth. The assumption is that in recent votes, there have been plants there and the vote has been cut off before there could be discussion. And all of those things create distrust and whatever. And I'm not saying those things are true. I'm just repeating what was said. So if they don't think there's trust or integrity, they are convinced that the session is not trustworthy at that, because they're manipulating things the way they want and are afraid to let the truth out there. People sometimes are afraid because they didn't know and they blame it on communication. But every church I go to blames it on communication, because we get, depending on sociologists, argue between whether we get 200,000 to 400,000 messages a day. All of us do in one way or another, and all of us have learned how to become selective listeners. Now, this doesn't mean you can't communicate better, but and the complaint is, well, some people don't have email, whatever, and that may be, but it's because they don't like what's happening. If they don't like what's happening, then they're questioning the integrity of the leaders. And I see that in almost every church I go into, where there is this level of disagreements. Okay.
So with these prescriptions, if we do that, then we are being obedient to the will of God, and that will address any of the concerns that you were hearing?
No, I would say, I would be very careful. The only one I would say is clearly against the will of God is disobedience to the Great Commission, the slander, the first one. That's where there's disobedience to God. Which structure you choose, to me, is a wisdom issue, not a God's will issue. The development of leaders is a wisdom issue, not a God's will issue. But I would be very clear to say the disobedient, the first prescription, concern and prescription, we are talking about what I believe to be the will of God. And by the way, now, this may not carry water with a lot of people because there are some who don't like eco because they don't like where the church is going, so the church is eco, therefore eco must be the problem. There's that whole deal. But from eco's perspective, everything I've said in that first prescription, eco says they believe the church here is here primarily to accomplish the Great Commission. That's why I quoted it out of the polity. That's where the denomination is, which obviously puts you 180 degrees from PCUSA. Okay. That's the only one I would talk about in terms of the will of God.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah.
Paul, how do we, this body or whatever coming after it, meaning this session or the next session, it continues to evolve over the years. If we vote and do this, how do you make it stick? What I mean by the first prescription, that is something that will happen, and you say, we have done that.
Right.
All the rest of them seem to be ongoing things.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm looking at the second one, a mission ministry audit. We actually started and tried to do that. We all, two session meetings, we sat down and went through all of our ministries and what should we stop doing? What should we start doing? And it just sort of, it piddled away as far as it just didn't stick. And the same thing with, we've restructured to have Connect consistently and worship weekly, and we've done the restructure, and now all of a sudden it's like, so we need to restructure again. And how do we keep this from feeling like the flavor of the week? And then the next session that comes in is like, that was that session in Paul, and we're doing our own thing. Because you'll have your next session coming in here, and I guess we're going to have a little bit longer time. Yeah. But how do we make it
that
stick?
first of all is where I think the criteria comes into play. In other words, if the mission frame is the centering, really what you're trying to do is to say, as we discern the theology of God, we're saying that the primary focus of the church has to be outward. It can no longer be inward. So that's why part of the criteria has to be, if you don't agree with that mission and vision, then you should not even be able to get on session if this is what the session has designed. It's not to eliminate, but it is to set a criteria so that you don't have this going on. Now, the structure I'm talking about in terms of the governance is that you haven't touched that. You still have the session managing, you still have the committees. That's brand new. That's not something you've done. That kind of structure is what I call affects the systemic, the whole system. When you're doing the other stuff, you're talking about the connecting and all that, that's not necessarily systemic at that point. So I'm trying to get to some systemic issues. So I can remember here, the second one on the audit. First of all, I wouldn't sit down in the session, and that to me is, now this is I work with churches, so I have the advantage of seeing what other people do. I wouldn't sit down in the session meeting and decide that. I would go to if you're a Sunday school class, I want to talk to the teacher and the 2 or 3 leaders and say, all right, here's where you are, what are you going to do? Okay, I would go to the small group leader and say, you're the leader, what are you going to do to fit that? Okay, to go to if there's a men's ministry, go to the men's. Say, what are you going to do? You should be fanning out and then coming back and say, all right, here's what this Sunday school class said they're going to do. Does that fit what we mean by that? Have we defined that, or do we need to define it better? So the idea that you're sitting around in session doing that, I would assume most session members don't know enough about everything to be able to do that.
You're exactly right, which is what happened.
Yeah,
We don't know what these are.
Yeah, and see, part of that is training to be an elder. Okay, let me say it this way. Somebody said to me, a person who's fairly highly respected in the conversation said, we're making church too complicated. It must be simple. And the answer is no. Running a highly effective church today is a very complicated discipline. Once you get to a church your size and larger, someone has compared the pastor's role to being like a president of a state university that's balancing. You got to balance alumni, you got to balance state legislature, you got to balance faculty, you got to balance the union, you got to balance the students. You got all this stuff going on. And how are we going to make that effective? It is not easy. It takes, and hear me well, it doesn't take seminary, because seminary, you don't learn it. But it does take going to conferences, going to churches that are doing it well, learning from them. I've had the advantage of being mentored by 3 people who were pretty wise about how the church should be run. And I Presbyterian luck, sovereignty, I got connected with these people. I would no more, I don't know what your business is, but I would no more sit and be on your board and tell you how you should run your church. And yet everybody thinks we can sit on a session and tell everybody how the church should be run. That's why I talked about children. I've heard around here that children, for the most part, aren't counted. Man, I would say to that preschool, I want to know how many unchurched families do you have or aren't going to church. We need to have a team of people over there. Every day they show up, giving those people coffee, inviting them. Preschool graduation ought to be held right in the middle of a Sunday morning worship cafe meeting so the parents are there. We honor them. Why? Because you got a mission field that's coming here that's not even being leveraged. You're focusing on children's Sunday school. Now, I mean, I'm talking pre-COVID. I'm not saying children shouldn't go to children's Sunday school, but if you want to reach unchurched children, what goes on during the worship service is more important than what goes on in the Sunday school. And because nobody studying this, learning this, you don't know how to make decisions because you don't have the context. And the same way that I'm not going to tell somebody how to do something I don't know about, and yet when it comes to church, we all think we know how to run church because we all work off of our experience, and a lot of our experience has not been good experience. That's why there needs to be the training. That's why I'm spending 40, by the way, we do an hour-and-a-half session meeting, and I do 45 minutes of training. And all of a sudden, our elders are realizing, man, there's a lot of stuff about church I don't know. There's a lot of things about leadership I don't know. Okay, and you know, I mean, you got Tom. What's Tom's last name? LaPointe, Labonte. 20 years as an airborne infantry. He ought to be teaching leadership. He gets it. I told him he was an oxymoron. I never saw anybody who was so caring that was a parachuter. I said, he's a Marine, you know. And yet he's the nicest, gentlest person. I said, this is like Murdoch. I said, Murdoch, you're the first balanced musician I've talked to. It's because he spends all his life as a business person. Okay. But I don't tell worship people how to do worship. Now, there's some things theologically I want to know, but I would no more tell Brad how to do a virtual service because I'm lucky to find my phone. Yeah, and yet we sit here and think that's why there needs to be the training. That's why that's so important. And if that is consistent and the pastor every year is training elders and training them in the concept, that's where you begin to build some consistency. And also the idea is that the only people who need to be elders, there needs to be a test. I mean, I thought what you said, Rich, about what you had to go through for that PCA church where there's 6 months of training, and that just even gets you to maybe be nominated, so I understood you correctly. And we're expecting people to do stuff that they have no expertise, all with good hearts. You have people often in churches sitting on the finance committee who may have an MBA and a CPA and know a lot about finances, but have no understanding about what it means to be generous Christians and how God's finances need to be handled. If you haven't read it, all of you should read It's Not Your Parents' Offering Plate. Okay, it's a little thin book, but all about church money. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I'm probably waxing longer than you wanted at this point. So, okay.
I think.
Okay.
Mark, and to your point, yes, we tried to figure out which ministries we were going to stop. We didn't get very far, and I do think it's because we tried to do it. But then God stopped it all. And now I think one thing I like about this is it's an invitation. We set the parameters. Here's what it looks like. And that's where we spend our time. And then it's up to those classes, each class, each ministry, choir, praise team, all of them. Are you going to do this? And show us 3 ways to do it. And then that's them buying into it as opposed to us making the decision for them. And I think that has a lot more, that sounds a lot better to me. That sounds more workable to me.
All right, folks, I have to go lead a PNC meeting on the West Coast. So, oh yes, I do. I'm coaching the PNC. So, no. I'm okay. I'm okay now. All right, but I need to get there. Yeah. One last question. Yeah.
Can we send emails to you to ask you some specifics as we kind of let this simmer a little bit?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
And I would say if you send an email, copy the rest of the session so they know what you're asking. But I'll be glad to do that. Sure. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Thank you.